No mai, haere mai, and welcome to the Social Impact and Research Seminar Series hosted by Oranga Tamariki, Ministry for Children. Ko Davina Jones Toku Ingoa, and I'll be your host for the next 90 minutes or so as we explore what the emerging insights and evidence tell us about changes and developments in the youth justice space. Before we continue, I'd like to open with a karakia. Kia hora te marino, kia whakapapa kunamu te moana. Hei huarahi mā tātou I te rangi nei. Aroha atu, aroha mai. Tātou e a tātou katoa. Hui e, tai ki e. And now just a few housekeeping reminders. We have an impressive number of attendees joining us online today. It's great to have you all with us. A reminder that we are filming this event and expect to publish the footage on our website. Please keep your cameras turned off and microphones on mute. A big thank you to those who submitted questions in advance during registration. These have been considered and incorporated into Ian's presentation or the Q&A session where possible. It's not too late to participate in this event. Use the Q&A function on Teams, not the chat, to submit your thoughts and questions during Ian's presentation. We'll be reviewing these for inclusion in the Q&A session, but given the large number of attendees, there undoubtedly will be many that we won't get to. We are excited to present Dr. Ian Mattison of Better Outcomes. Ian will be known to many of you through his many years of research and practice in the youth justice sector, both in Aotearoa and overseas. Ian's presentation will walk us through the many ways this sector has changed and adapted to new realities and what the evidence is pointing to as emerging and effective interventions. I'll now hand over to you, Ian.
Many years experience, Davina. Morena, good morning, everybody. Lovely to be here. Great to see so many people from across youth justice and other people who are interested in this sector. Today, I'm going to talk about evidence. I'll be largely focusing on research evidence, but as most of you will know, this area is messy, it is complex, and I'll be drawing other forms of evidence as well and trying to join up some dots. I grandly use the word international. There are 195 countries recognized by the United Nations. We won't be covering them all. I'll largely be looking at Anglo-American countries. However, I will draw on some evidence from Europe and a couple of reports from UNICEF that included material from 120 countries. So primarily those countries that we would generally recognize as having systems similar to our own. My session will be in 4 parts. I'm going to talk about context, international trends, international evidence, and international enablers. And I will sprinkle through the presentation examples of either promising practice or programs or things that might be of interest to us that are actually happening elsewhere. What I will not be telling you is that there's a banging program in Texas that you must implement tomorrow. I'm of the view that programs from other countries need to be cultivated and watered very, very carefully and aren't necessarily going to grow. It's as much to let you reflect on what's happening elsewhere and making some comparison for yourself in terms of what things are like here and maybe giving you some ideas for the future. As a pretend academic, there will be a reference list that you can access afterwards when you access the presentation. And we'll also do a short list of potential areas that any of you might want to follow up with in terms of some further reading. So why does this matter now? Well, youth justice is changing internationally and quite rapidly. Some of those changes were in fact already underway before COVID, but in many ways the pandemic has exacerbated or revealed weaknesses that were perhaps already present. Rightly or wrongly, I tend to think of youth justice in terms of pre-COVID and post-COVID. But it's important to recognise that this area is not settled. I think COVID has introduced some new ideas, some new challenges, things are being tested. So I think we have seen some significant shifts, either in total or in part. Systems also face greater scrutiny, rightly so, and there's less tolerance for harm. New Zealand is not the only jurisdiction to have had a Royal Commission on the abuse of children care. There have been a number of Royal Commissions across Anglo-American countries and similar mechanisms over recent years. At the same time, governments reasonably expect results from their investments in youth justice. But as I said, this is quite a contested area between evidence, politics, and public debates. They often diverge. So let's look at some context. So COVID disrupted the whole youth justice pathway, including policing, courts, detention centres, schools, community services, and family support systems. Many, if not most, jurisdictions saw a sharp fall in contact. However, this did conceal some of the underlying system strains. School disruption in particular, and reduced face-to-face support intensified concerns about adolescent mental health and well-being. COVID also accelerated broader changes in adolescence itself. There's a new body of research that's exploring how the notion of being an adolescent has in fact changed over the last 10 or 20 years, with many children actually taking fewer risks than you and me did when we were in our teenage years. COVID also highlighted some workplace pressures and made these more visible as well. Now, this table, I've called it earlier youth justice system approaches. This is kind of the old orthodoxy of where different countries sat in terms of their different approaches to youth justice. So this is about nearly 20 years old. Now, it's a typology. I like typologies, but they're only as useful as long as they're useful. So this has divided Western countries, predominantly Anglo-American and European, into 5 different approaches to youth justice. So the first one is called the welfare model. So this is systems where there isn't really the same distinction between care and protection and youth justice that we have in New Zealand. And in some respects, this would be quite similar to what New Zealand had before the '89 Act. So, for example, Norway's on that list. Norway is a country the same size as New Zealand, doesn't have a youth court. Children are predominantly dealt through the welfare system. And it also recently only had 8 youth detention beds for the entire country. And the type of child welfare system it has is very much around family support. The justice category is about accountability and focuses on deeds. So many of the US states would have had that approach. And when you see films on TV with kids in orange jumpsuits or shackled, that's very much the justice orientation. And the US has moved towards that over the last 20, 30, 40 years, although some states are beginning to move away from it again. Minimal intervention, avoiding net widening, diversion from criminal proceedings, decarceration. Traditionally, that has been the Scottish approach. Restorative justice, New Zealand clearly, and the beautifully named neo-correctionalist. And I don't think that name was chosen as a compliment. So neo, new, correctionalist, a more punitive approach than had been the case before, associated with New Labour and Tony Blair's government in England, in the UK. And their slogan at the time was addressing youth crime and the causes of youth crime. So that kind of twin approach. So I'm going to demonstrate there's been some mingling of those over recent years, but historically, that's where we're coming from in broad terms. As I say, it's a typology, so it is a simplified version of reality, but I think conceptually it is useful for us. So we do have some mingling of these different models. There is some shared language, but the terms don't always mean the same in different jurisdictions or indeed different organizations. So the word therapeutic gets a lot of usage in youth justice, as does trauma informed. But when you poke below them, sometimes there's less substance to them than would appear to be the case from the outside. There's also a wider range of developmental approaches, also rights-based approaches, and more consideration of risk management logics as well. So all of these are coexisting as well. Youth justice evidence is a bit mixed. It tends to be fragmented. Very few governments commission large studies that look across youth justice. So you tend to get smaller studies on particular dimensions. And statistics, I'll touch on later, but statistics, official statistics, are usually between 13 and 25 months after the reality when they're published. So their ability to help us tends to be compromised. So all of that, particularly in a fast-moving time during and post-COVID, media and political narratives can sometimes fill any gaps. So let's turn and look at some international trends. Across Anglo-American countries and European countries that I've looked at, fewer youths are entering the youth justice system. And this has been a long-term decline. Diversion has become a significant part of the system. And as I said before, there is less adolescent risk-taking, and offending has in some respects become less normalised. Judith Bell, actually a Kiwi, I believe, did a recent article on this whole phenomenon, which I think is quite interesting and does link to COVID as well. But we know from the numbers that fewer youths are entering the youth justice system. They've either been formally diverted or informally diverted and dealt with by other means. And that reflects youth offender downwards trajectories. Now, as everybody here knows, there's no objective measure of youth crime. And different jurisdictions have a multitude of different ways of using proxies to capture that, whether it's counts, rates, offenders, offences, arrests, police accusations. And all jurisdictions do it differently. But these three graphs are fairly typical. A New Zealand graph would look pretty much the same, of how the number of youth offenders has been on a steady downwards trajectory for the last 10, 15, 20 years, and in some jurisdictions, longer than that. Now, for those of you that have been on holiday to Australia in the last 2 or 3 years, I will emphasise, particularly going to the Sunshine Coast, I will emphasise that Australia is countrywide. There will be variations across provinces in Canada, across states in Australia, But that is the national pattern over the last 10 or so years. If you look carefully at Australia, you'll see a COVID drop and then a COVID increase, post-COVID increase, but it's not that big. More marked in Canada, but we're back to the downwards trajectory, and you're not really seeing much of a blip in England and Wales at all. That's the headline figures. There is evidence, but it's still coming because the official stats tend to be 13 to 25 months behind reality. And there isn't really much research yet on this that builds on those. There is evidence that in some jurisdictions, there were changes in offending behaviour after COVID as well. Some jurisdictions reported more violent offending. Some reported more groups of young people involved in thefts. But in other jurisdictions, that wasn't the case. So there does appear to have been some changes that appear at this stage to have largely reverted back to where they were before. So, for example, serious and persistent offender stats had a bit of a jump, but by and large, they seem to be back to pre-COVID levels. But I would say that quite cautiously because that's just on the basis of initial data that I've seen. You will have experience yourselves that's likely to be much more up to date than that. So I think there's a question there about what the impact of COVID was on young people. Some of those young people that were seriously offending after COVID may well be sitting in adult prison, so they've made their way through the system. So I think that adds a little bit of complexity as well. So combining those last two slides, we have a smaller cohort for the youth justice system to work with. That smaller cohort is by definition more concentrated. Collectively, young people with a higher level of complexity. There's a question as to whether individually there's a higher level of complexity as well. And I don't think we can definitively answer that question yet. High levels of trauma, neurodisability, fetal alcohol spectrum disorders, mental health needs, substance abuse concerns. These are front and center. They might have been peripheral considerations 10 years ago. That wouldn't be the case now. And indeed, in Canada, for example, much of youth justice is clearly framed around these issues. Exclusion from family, school, culture, and other protective relationships are key considerations as well. And we do have young people involved in repeated patterns of offending, exclusion, unmet need, and continual system involvement. And some systems are struggling on how to deal best with those particular young people. So just to pick up the point again about those quite diverse models earlier on, converging. I'd say internationally, the professional and policy consensus has grown quite considerably. Our provision is more child-centered, has aspirations to be more relational, and takes more developmental appropriate approaches. And as I said, most jurisdictions now blend multiple youth justice traditions. And so, for example, there will be countries in that table before that have shifted quite considerably. Others, not so much. But there are some exceptions. So, for example, Northern Territories and Queensland. Northern Territories had a Royal Commission on Youth Detention and Child Protection and put in place a a range of ambitious measures in order to develop youth justice in that territory. That was on the back of a Four Corners TV documentary that filmed a young person being tied up in a chair with a spit hood, caused a public outrage. And so a number of things were put in place. Much of that has been reversed. So they put up the age of criminal responsibility. That has gone back. And importantly, youth detention is no longer a last resort as required by the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. And Queensland's taken a similar approach on last resort as well. So we do have these international trends, but there'll be variations, and it could be argued there are some jurisdictions that may be going in quite the opposite direction. And with so much change, there is, of course, political media and online contestation. So a couple of slides talking about youth detention. UNICEF, so this is the 120 country study I mentioned. UNICEF estimates there are around 67,000 fewer children in detention in 2024 than there were in 2018. That's a mighty big number. Now that does include police detention, so it's quite a broad definition, but it gives you a clear signal of how things have been moving internationally. There have been substantial long-term reductions in the UK, the US, and several other jurisdictions. Not all. So one or two of those Australian states are increasing as well, but the international trend is downwards. England and Wales has a population of 60 million. Last figures I saw for last year, they had 350 children and young people in youth detention. So if you divide that by 12, make a comparison to New Zealand, do the maths, that's a low number. California, as a state, has closed its federal youth detention facilities altogether, and those young people will be now dealt with at the county level. So we have seen some fairly massive reductions. The number of girls in detention in some jurisdictions has also fallen. So, for example, in England and Wales, there are no girls in young offenders institutions. So England and Wales has technically three different types of youth detention, one of which is young offenders institutions that are run by the prison service. There are no girls in those at all. The primary reason for that is that last year, whilst they made up around 2% of the population, they accounted for a quarter of all the self-harm incidents. And the year before, they accounted for half of the self-harm incidents. So very much from a safety perspective, girls have been moved out of that, remembering there are alternatives. So there are secure children's homes, there are secure training centres, and although it's now temporarily closed, there's the secure school I'll touch on in a minute as well. So remand now dominates many detention populations. So I've done a table there just to give you some figures, and there's been some slight increases over recent years, but as most of you will know, that New Zealand rates are actually higher than those. So again, we're going through internationally a period of change, which means that more short stays, more transporting, more processing, and greater population instability. And you also have facilities that are serving a purpose they weren't necessarily designed for. Okay, so within that, youth detention models are changing as well. So the shifts from the large prison-like facilities to smaller and more local models. As some of you will be aware, Scotland has no young people in youth detention centres at all. So that was a change they brought in a couple of years ago. They have small numbers in something that looks a bit like one of our care and protection residences that are run by 4 different charities, but they moved kids out of the Young Offenders Institution 2 years ago, and they say they are not going back. We're seeing in some jurisdictions moves towards a fully professional workforce. I'd highlight Ireland. Ireland requires a professional qualification. It also requires 2 years post-qualifying experience. And they have an exceptionally broad salary range. The salary range almost doubles from the original salary in order to try and keep people. Norway. I said Norway had 8 beds. They're in the process of building another similar facility. Their model is run within the prison service, and they have a split staffing of prison officers and therapists, 50-50, but their prison officers will be degree qualified as well. And some of them will have specialist post-qualifying qualifications. And Diagrama, that is the Spanish organization that delivers much of the youth detention in Spain. They recently set up in Australia. Diagrama's particularly interesting because of the research done on their outcomes. So Diagrama, I think there are about 30 facilities. They won't all be secure, but about 30 facilities in Spain. And in one region, their return to custody rate over 6 years, so into adulthood, was only 14%, having been in a Diagrama youth detention facility. They look a bit crap. They're not fancy designer architect type facilities. The kitchens in them look a bit like your grandmother's kitchen if she was Spanish, but staff are all qualified, kind of professionally registered, and very, very relational. They take a particularly strong relational approach. But interestingly, they have a few security guards. So it's a different model. It's a cheaper model, but it's one that has delivered a lot of success in Spain, and that has been independently researched. A lot of talk about home-like and therapeutic ambitions. The Netherlands has 2 kinds of youth detention centres. There's a traditional one you might expect, and there's others that are much smaller and based in communities. They might have sort of 6 to 8 young people. Tasmania is looking at being more home-like. It's cited quite a lot. The English ones, the secure children's homes, some of them are small and home-like. Some of them try to be, but they're really serving too many children. Some of the English ones will have as few as 6 to 8 children in. But it's certainly much of the debate that we're hearing about. And alternatives to secure, such as semi-secure and non-secure. This kicked off actually in the US. So the Missouri model's been around for many years, where they look to move kids from traditional detention centres into semi and non-secure provision, and that's deemed to be pretty successful. New York City adopted that model with an initiative called Closer to Home. And again, if you think of films you've seen of US detention centres for young people, they're way out in the middle of nowhere, and they're very traditionally prison orientated. So they've shifted, and much of that work's done by not-for-profits in the city of New York. And we're also seeing a more diverse range of providers. The number of US private providers has fallen. Some of the English and Welsh provision was privately operated by international conglomerates. Some of you will be aware of Serco, for example, who do or did run the Auckland Women's Prison. They were running one of the youth detention centres in England. They have largely disappeared from the English landscape. What we are seeing is more charities or not-for-profits delivering youth detention rather than the government. Okay, so we talked about fewer people coming into the youth justice system. We talked about fewer young people in detention. Disproportionality remains entrenched. Severe Indigenous overrepresentation across Australia, Canada. You know the situation in New Zealand. And it's not necessarily getting any better. Those falling numbers do not automatically improve equity, and those disparities seem to accumulate across the entire system. So Indigenous children might be overrepresented in the early part of the system, but by the time they get to youth detention, it's even higher. And we've seen some recent stats from Queensland where the rate of incarceration of Indigenous children has actually increased significantly in the last year or two. So that is remaining a major challenge. Early intervention alone is insufficient without wider system change. Okay, let's look at some international evidence. I've got a shot for you. It's not really changed that much. We kind of know how to help children in the youth justice system, but I think we could be more confident around the evidence on diversion. More and more evidence to support this, whether it is police instigated diversion, whether it's more formal diversion or it's incarceration reviews. Limiting unnecessary formal justice contact is paramount, is a conclusion that many jurisdictions have come to. I think the challenge now is to, in some jurisdictions, move beyond the notion of diversion. One, diversion can mean different things in different places, as can the word caution. So in some jurisdictions, young people and children are getting diverted from the youth justice system altogether. And in other jurisdictions, they are being diverted from the formal legal process. And I think that distinction is important because there is a tension between diversion sometimes and early intervention, and the need for us to get perhaps more sophisticated about diversion and making it more proportionate and appropriate for the needs of the young person. Cognitive behavioral therapy and skills-based approaches, again, stronger evidence on them over recent years, particularly around violence prevention. Particularly when focused on problem solving, self-control and behavioral change. And remember, there's a variety of different versions of some of these programs, and not all will be available everywhere. There is a caveat to that some cognitive behavioral therapy is cognitive behavioral therapy style, and it doesn't necessarily have the same degree of fidelity and program content. But what has been through the evidence system does appear to be stronger, and we can be more confident in that. And a bit like the last slide, the evidence is strongest when cognitive behavioral therapy is structured, skills focused and matched to the child's risks and needs. Family whānau community. The structural stuff would be around programs to do with multi-systemic therapy and functional family therapy. both of which are widely available in New Zealand and many jurisdictions. MSD in particular, particularly designed to address serious antisocial behaviour, and that's widely used in Europe as well. Implementation really matters, and the need to follow up and provide some cohesion, rather than just see these as light touch initiatives in the preventative sphere. These can be used much more seriously right across the system. And more focus on developmental prevention, and indeed stronger long-term evidence around this. And a recent evidence review, an umbrella review of various reviews, identified risk and protective factors across individual, family, school, and neighbourhood domains. Thinking beyond, where does youth justice fit in the ecosystem of child and family welfare? So that very much aligns with the developmental and ecological approach. And youth crime prevention, we'll be talking about fetal alcohol syndrome. And clearly that starts way back at the point of pregnancy. So right through the spectrum, there are a number of ways we can think more creatively about offending and how to prevent it. So some international enablers. Complex cohorts require specialist practice. I would argue from the emerging evidence, and I won't say this is definitive, but from the emergency evidence, that more concentrated and potentially complex cohorts need higher levels of capability right through the system. If we're going to be relational, and if we're going to be developmental, that's highly skilled work. Workforce stability and supervision matter, and youth justice is a specialised area of practice. UK has led on quite a lot of specialist training in youth justice. The University of East Anglia? Suffolk, sorry, the University of Suffolk has a degree in youth justice. There's a pathway into that degree qualification through other qualifications. The University of Strathclyde has an online postgraduate certificate in youth justice. So there are opportunities, and that was available to people in Australia and New Zealand. There are opportunities out there already where jurisdictions are beefing up the level of training required. In many jurisdictions, a qualification is mandatory, including in youth detention. Now, sometimes that's to have a qualification or in the process of gaining one, but it is mandatory in some places. It's mandatory in the young offenders institutions in England and Wales, for example, where those units would be staffed by prison officers. So issues of qualification, registration in some jurisdictions, like being a social worker registered, and ongoing training has become a priority in a number of jurisdictions. Better pathways require better system alignment. As you will know, many youth are already known to care and protection, or indeed out-of-home care, education, disability, mental health and substance abuse services. Some research around crossover kids. Not sure I love the term, but it's widely used. Research in England and Australia around that, identifying the need for active pathway coordination, not sequential referrals. Fragmented systems create fragmented pathways. And reintegration and transitions are seen as increasingly important, particularly in relation to youth detention. Right, we have more child-centred frameworks and tools to increasingly shape practice. When I started my career, there probably weren't any. We would have been using adult tools, adult practice frameworks. You will recognise one or two there. The Good Lives model, for example, initially developed for adult sex offenders, although it has been used with adolescents, and the risk needs repository tool at the bottom is still quite widely used, but most of the rest are very youth specific. And timely information that supports learning. Systems increasingly need up-to-date information, particularly when the environment they're operating within is moving. One interesting response was in England and Wales, the Youth Justice Board that oversees youth justice across England and Wales. They, in response to public alarm about knife crimes, started to produce quarterly data rather than annual data, which filled the vacuum that others were filling in social media. One of the challenges, I think, in jurisdictions like Australia is that their official statistics are excellent, they're comprehensive, and they go back many years. But because they have to talk to so many different governments, it is a time-consuming process to actually pull them together. Even more the case in Canada and the US. The complexity there is just phenomenal. And I'm not sure I've seen particularly useful stats from the US since about 2020. So I'd argue timely information is really important. But also practice, lived experience and operational knowledge should also inform services and adaptation. And there's also still a role for formative evaluation to help new initiatives learn and adapt early, or as the corporate world would say, fast fail. And the other enabler is that leadership that can hold the system together, particularly in a period of change. So maintaining direction and coherence. Connecting policy intent with operational systems of frontline practice. Aligning agencies around children's pathways, needs and outcomes. And valuing different sorts of evidence. And the challenge of trying to balance public, political and operational pressures without losing direction. And particularly in those jurisdictions that have been involved in major reform programs, that has been particularly apparent over the last few years. Okay, so just to wrap up, youth justice is still adjusting after COVID. Fewer children are entering formal systems. There are smaller cohorts with greater complexity. And the needs of those young people that are in the system may be more complex individually as well. Child-first approaches, child-centered approaches are gaining influence. We see that. We already had that in much of Europe. We're now seeing that in England and Wales. It was already in place in Scotland. But even many jurisdictions in the US have taken a much more developmental approach around children in the youth justice system. And indeed, some US states would have lower levels of young people in detention, and perhaps we do. Remand has been growing as an issue, and disproportionality remains unsolved. And knowing what helps children is necessary, but is not sufficient. Increasingly, the challenge is building youth justice systems capable of recognizing complexity, responding proportionally, and sustaining skilled child and family-centred practice across a range of different services and timelines. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Ian. That was truly fascinating and has provided a lot of food for thought. For the final part of this event, the Q&A session, we are joined by the National Manager for Youth Justice at Oranga Tamariki, Jono Brooker. Thanks for joining us, Jono.
No worries. Good to be here.
So there's been a lot of interest in this topic, Ian, and we received many questions in advance of this event. And I know many of our frontline are here interested in what's happening internationally, especially initiatives that show promise. One particular area of interest from the questions that came in is in interventions that effectively and sustainably address early care and protection concerns, and so disrupt any potential pathways to entrenchment in the youth justice system. Ian, did you come across anything in your research that could add to the conversation there about effective early interventions? And then I'll go over to you, Jono, about is there work underway here at Oranga Tamariki on this? So going to you, first, Ian.
It's a good question. It is a growing concern, and I think we need to talk about what that concern is and just try and bring a bit more clarity to that. But it is an important issue. By coincidence, there's been coverage in the UK this week about the 1993 murder of James Bolger. Older ones, if you will remember, two 10-year-olds who murdered a 2-year-old. And their case comes up depending on the political discussions of the day. So that was a useful reminder for us. So it's not a new issue, but it is an important one. I think there's a couple of questions. One is, what can we do to help children in the here and now who may be exhibiting those kind of behaviours? And I think the second question is, how do we need to calibrate our broader system? And I don't mean the youth justice system, but broader than that, in order to better respond to future occurrences of such behaviour from other people. There may be instances of practice that are ahead of the research on this, but I don't think so. The international research is very clear that we should not be setting up programs for young offenders. We need to be thinking of it developmentally. There are some programs in the US that are privately run as part of what's called the challenging teen industry, that purport to address the concerns of rich parents, but there's no evidence to support that. What the evidence does support is looking at intensive family and parenting support, develop neurodisability informed assessment, stronger education, engagement, stable care, and stable out-of-home care, foster care, residential care, therapeutic and behavioural supports, and avoiding unnecessary criminalisation. And some of that is doing what we do better, in terms of our child protection work, our health work, our education work, our community work, in terms of just the foster care and residential care, the whole thing about stability and unnecessary placements and breakdowns, all that kind of stuff, all that contributes to it. The other point I'll make, as I touched on this before, is that whilst there aren't and shouldn't probably be youth-focused programs for younger children, there are lots of other programs and services, some of which could either be adapted to address more behavioural issues, or there might in fact be better versions, individual versions of those programs that people could get accredited for. So, for example, Incredible Years and PPP, I tend to think of them as sort of way down the prevention end of the spectrum, and they tend to be delivered quite generically in local areas for either universally or on a targeted basis for new parents who want to learn a bit more about how to raise children. But in fact, they could be more strategically used for some groups of parents. But it's also about home visiting services, or how do we support children in the early years, particularly in those first 1,000 days. How do we get them into early education, the transition to school, transition to secondary school? So I hope that doesn't feel as if I'm dodging the question. I don't think there's a magic answer, but I think we need to look beyond. We need to think earlier, and it does require a bit of a shift in terms of the child protection system, which tends to be referral orientated, intervention, withdrawal. Other countries that seem to be managing better do seem to have probably more funding, broader legislation to enable them to support families.
Thank you, Ian. And over to you, Jono. Is there work underway here at Oranga Tamariki on this?
Yeah, I was just going to say there are a couple of programs that we do work alongside our partners, one being Oranga Rangatahi program. So we have 7 of those programs that work across Central North Island. It's kind of that early intervention, trying to reduce escalation into the system, and they're majority working alongside our iwi and Māori providers within those communities, so rural communities where there isn't a lot of service available. So we're working, and the referrals come from the police predominantly or from schools. So we're doing all of that work to reduce opportunities to come into the system, and really high success rates and really good engagement. And it talks to some of the points you raised earlier in around that relational work that is needed, and how highly skillful it is. And those relationships are enduring, and it makes a really significant impact. And we also have the fast track tables that were born out of the RAM raids that received a lot of media attention back in 2021. Like they were a brand new shiny thing that nobody had seen before, and out of that became a multidisciplinary approach that's kind of been set up around the country. And again, that's targeting a younger cohort again, and it's with the MDT approach, bringing in other people from different organisations who are leads and who have that information. So again, that is that alignment and that sharing of information that allows for a better informed approach to be taken that addresses the needs of the young person, the whānau, and that holistic approach. And I think that's really important as well. And again, and the success rate of that has been really amazing. With it's a 70% of those that have been initially referred into that haven't come back to the attention. So again, there's some really good work going on in that intervention, early intervention space. It's something that probably needs to have, ideally a future state if that was rolled out in more places around the country, but for where it is currently, there's some really good success in those spaces.
Thank you, Jono. I'm going to continue with you now, just to ask you to respond to questions we've received about trends in our system in relation to young people who are neurodiverse, disabled, or with mental health challenges. There's also concern for young people with FASD. Jono, can you talk to us about support in our youth justice system for this group, and what policies or practices have been used or we might consider in the future?
Yeah, like it is a huge challenge, and I think those that work in youth justice know that, you know, a significant number of rangatahi that we work alongside do. There's a lot of suspected diagnosis that haven't been formally diagnosed, but for those that are in it, they go, oh, we think something's here, but we haven't had those formal diagnoses happen. We are currently doing a review of rangatahi and youth justice to kind of be more informed around those that are presenting that are neurodiverse, have disability or mental health challenges, and the prevalence of ADHD is really high, so which isn't surprising. But again, it's getting a more fuller picture and being more informed so that we can then adapt our approach and change, you know, be tailored to the needs of our rangatahi. And that also applies into the residential setting. There was a slide back earlier, Ian, in your presentation around kind of the remand populations in Aotearoa. We kind of sit around on average 85% remand population, which is again a really high transient population in or out, and often again having that right level of care and therapeutic support for those is really important. So, and with the prevalence of those that are neurodiverse, disabled, or have mental health challenges, there lies a really big challenge in how do we support them as best we can in a challenging environment that doesn't always allow for that. So yeah, it's definitely something that I think is, you know, it's going to keep increasing with the more research and that we can gain on it, and obviously the likes of Ian and other leaders in this space to inform and guide us in that as well will be really helpful.
Can I just add a comment? That's really good, John. Absolutely. Can I just add a comment about some research that was done in Australia at Banksia Hill Youth Detention Centre? So that's the single youth detention centre in Western Australia. Now, this is a few years old, but as well as being research, they did health assessments of all the young people taking part in the research. And they assessed 100 young people, and at least 89% of them had at least one domain of severe neurodevelopmental impairment. 36 out of 100 had FASD, and only 2 had been previously diagnosed. So I think that's a useful insight into another system. It might be a bit different here, but the magnitude of that is pretty powerful and has implications on how we design and deliver services as well.
Thank you, Jono and Ian, for that. Yeah, and we heard quite a lot during the presentation, you know, in terms of meeting those multiple and complex needs that young people often present with. We heard quite a little bit about the need for qualified and trained professionals. I have a question from the Q&A. What is the thinking around Māori and Indigenous practitioners being viewed as specialists for those population groups? Thinking of special skills and relevant skills needed to work with particular groups of young people.
I can talk about Australia. So we have a wider context in Australia of some organisations determining they're no longer appropriate to care for First Nations children. They are Western organisations with Western ethoses. And so, for example, Life Without Barriers has given some 10 years notice that it's going to withdraw from that area, and is going to work with Aboriginal controlled organisations to look to transition those arrangements. And I think that gives them an opportunity to look ahead and look at what particular cultural and other skills will be required. I think workforce is a challenging issue because we know we all have our ideas what we'd like to look like. There's a reality. Personally, I would like to see all detention centre workers have a professional qualification, but that would take 10 years itself. to bring that about. So a lot of work has to be done behind the scenes. So yes, I think there are issues around determining what are the needs of the cohorts we're trying to care for, and then what are the most appropriate skills that we need to have for them, and how we're going to develop those.
Okay, thank you. We've also had a question, one for both of you. If money were a bottomless pit, what 3 things would you invest in first to reduce offending behaviours? And I think this was echoed with a question from the chat as well, in terms of if you were in charge, how you would run the YJ system. So I think it's not only about the money, but the focus on what will make a difference. What would be your top go-to things? One of you would like to start.
My first one is a cheat. So I would impose income tax at the rate that Scandinavian countries have, so we have more resources to afford the level of family support that we'd like to see. My other top one would be robust alternatives to detention. So I said England's got about 350 kids in youth detention at the moment, and that's not because they've gone soft on crime. They have a whole series of options that are very structured that can be considered, developed, and supported. Whether that's intensive foster care, whether it's reporting in the evenings and weekends. Yes, there's the ankle bracelets, but there's also other options as well in terms of intensive support. They seem to be robust. Now, they're not necessarily evidence informed. Well, they're evidence informed, but they're not particularly evidence supported. The ethos seems to be they probably do less harm rather than necessarily being huge benefits. And there is a financial dimension to them as well. But I think we need to be more discriminating about who we put into youth detention. And I think that would be a way of doing that. The third area would be around, I'd look at the early intervention space, whether we're trying to divert kids away from the system or whether we need to ramp supports around them for potentially a number of years, and being clear on which and why.
Anything to add to that, Jono, from your perspective?
Yeah, I'd love to spend some money. So yeah, I'm the same with Ian, like absolutely early intervention, like if we can and enhance, and enable our community to do more. Like they're the experts in the community that are doing the daily work with our rangatahi and whānau, so giving them the resources and the tools that they've got to kind of really get in there and make the difference that is needed. And again, it's enduring and long lasting. So for me, that would be amazing. And secondly, just the workforce, the social work profession, in terms of those that are coming, enrolling to study social work in New Zealand, those that are graduating, like that is a challenge that is on the horizon for what does the social work workforce look like? So being agile and again, I agree with being, having a professional qualification, but changing out, maybe looking at how we set our workforce and, having a multidisciplinary approach with people bringing different skills and strengths into working alongside rangatahi and whānau. I think that is something I think would be really cool to do, and people bring that experience from other aspects of the worlds that they've worked in, and I think that could be really innovative for youth justice as well.
And we've got another theme coming through in the questions submitted to the Q&A is about the relevance of lived experience, both in terms of practitioners who come with particular cultural expertise and lived experience, but also in terms of the rangatahi themselves. And what we've learned directly from YJ involved rangatahi and their voices and lived experience, and how these have contributed to research and how that's been taken into changing, amending, tweaking services and provision. I don't know whether you're able to take that one to start with, Jono, about the voices of the young people and what we're hearing from them.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we have through Voice Whakaronga Mai and other forums to hear that those that have experienced care have been in the system, because they have lived it, and then they can provide that really rich feedback on what has worked well, what hasn't worked so well, and how we can be better and improve. But I'm all for hearing from those that have, unfortunately been in this justice system and how we can do things better, because, and also they know what works and what doesn't work, and sometimes the interventions or plans that we've put in place, we may think it's the right thing, and they'll tell us pretty quickly if it's not right and why it's not right, and that we've got it wrong. And so I think that lived experience and what they can provide and that knowledge is really important.
Absolutely agree with Jono.
Yeah, I have to say, from the research and evaluation perspective, we do work with both our own team in the social impact and research team, and we work collaboratively with the Voices of Children team to make sure that on our evaluations, wherever possible, the voices of lived experiences and of rangatahi and tamariki are included in those pieces of work.
I think internationally we got better at talking in a range of young people lived experience. I think historically there's been a tendency to have a handful. But between research, consultation, co-design, I think we get a much richer range of views, and indeed Royal Commissions. We got a lot of lived experience through that as well.
Yeah.
And I guess the issue is then what organisations do with that in terms of improving services and design and delivery.
Question for you, Jono. In terms of recent research and evaluation, we've had some questions about how the ministry implements research findings and the findings of evaluation, how that makes a difference to the practice that we see on the ground.
Yeah, I was just thinking of, I think with respect to the overrepresentation, that is very much true in Aotearoa. There was the Ministry of Justice Youth Justice Indicator Summary Report, I think that came out in February, which is online, which kind of, if people wanted to look at that, that does kind of highlight some of those statistics around the overrepresentation, because I think that has come up as people kind of curious, what does it look like in this country? So yeah, we're always looking at kind of the trends and patterns of what's happening internationally and how we can modify or do things differently within a New Zealand context. There's a slide previously about the role of MST. We have MST. We use that as part of our service delivery, and to great success as well. And again, that's something that, again, because there's an international, it's evidence-based, and we've brought it in, or it's been in Aotearoa for a number of years now. But again, it's trying to see what else, where other, New Zealand was perceived to be, one of the leads in youth justice, with the inception of the Family Group Conference and where that sat. And so again, people would be learning off us and taking things from what New Zealand was doing. So we're always trying to do the same and see what we can do differently. And that also, to be fair, is listening to our providers who we work alongside, and their ideas and their thoughts as to how we need to shift or do things differently. So yeah, although we Oranga Tamariki, I think we don't work in isolation, and we're definitely working alongside our providers and partners to provide a better service, that's for sure.
And one final theme for questions. People have asked about the use of secure care I guess, in residences and how this has evolved over time. I don't know whether you found anything out about that in your research, Ian.
It's dirty dark secret in some places, and it's difficult to get much exposure to that. So if by that you mean the use of locked parts of the facility for young people, we've got the OPCAT. New Zealand's been part of the Option Protocol on the against the torture of children and inhumane for 25 years, I think. And that responsibility is spread between some of your oversight agencies. Australia's only recently signed up for it fully. And the OPCAT register, the OPCAT inspectors from overseas were refused entry into facilities in some states because they weren't on board with this whole process. I think our language is important. Some youth detention facilities actually have kids in their cells most of the time anyway, which is horrific. At best, they'll have a minority of hours out of their room / cell. And it gets confusing in terms of legal authority and different jurisdictions between getting into the facility and then being segregated from others inside. So it is a high profile issue. And I think it's one we need to keep our attention on, particularly when sometimes it's because of staffing shortages.
Right.
So I think for the next few years, this is going to be high profile. Particularly, I mean, OPCAT's not signed up to by the US, kind of obviously, but not Canada either. So it's us, UK, and newly, Ireland are, and newly Australia. But I think that's worth watching in terms of our treatment and the intent we have, and sometimes what happens.
Anything to add to that, Jono, from the point of view of practice within our residences?
Not specifically. It's not my area of expertise. I don't want to speak out of turn on it. But I mean, Ian's on the money with the challenges that sits within that space.
Yeah.
Some of which is linked to your workforce, not your workforce, the workforces, and getting alignment between the intent and the practice support to make sure that actually happens, and them having the capability and the support to be able to do that.
Yeah.
So there's a whole spectrum-wide issue, I think, internationally.
Yeah. Okay, well, no new themes are coming through, and we're wrapping up towards the end of our time now. So that's all we have time for today. I'd like to just extend a very heartfelt thanks to Dr. Ian Mattison for his scholarship, his expertise, informed not only, from academic style research, but also his experience on the ground working in some of these facilities during his career. I'd also like to thank Jono Brooker for joining us and giving us that operational perspective. And thank you for your interest and attendance. So many people have attended today. We will be sharing the slides afterwards. We'll be publishing them on our website. And if you haven't already, please email us to join our mailing list. We'll let you know when the material is available on our website, and it will be the slides, not just the recording. You can also find all our publications at ot.govt.nz/research. And we look forward to you joining us at future sessions. I'll now close with a karakia. Onohia, onohia, onohia ki te uru tapunui, kia wātia, kia mama, te nako, te tinana, te wairua i te ara tangata, koia rā e rongo, whakairea atu ki runga, kia tina, huie tai kie. Ka kite.